The original Dragon Quest trilogy was a pretty big deal in the history of gaming. With each release, new ideas and features found their way into video games even outside the RPG genre. With the third release and the completion of the trilogy, this was a big game. For platforming fans, there was Super Mario Bros. 3, for RPG fans, there was Dragon Quest 3. While the majority of its popularity was only experienced in Japan, this was both one of the top-selling and critically top-rated games in the entire NES and Famicom library. Dragon Quest III sold over 1 million copies on the first day of release in Japan. In fact, almost 300 Japanese students were arrested for skipping school in order to purchase the game on release day. It went on to become the best-selling game in Japan among all games released from 1986 to 1989. Popular gaming magazine Famitsu ranked Dragon Quest III as one of the most favorite games of all time among both critics and readers, even holding third place until 2006, almost 20 years after its release in Japan. Conversely, while 3.8 million copies were sold in Japan, only 95,000 were sold in the United States. This was also due in part to its late localization in the West, releasing after the Super Nintendo had already reached American gamers. Luckily, the game received a little bit of recognition in the US as one of the greatest RPGs available on the Game Boy Color, receiving exceptional scores and marketing the game to an audience who had already moved on from the NES. Dragon Quest III is still seen as one of the greatest and highest-selling RPGs in Japanese gaming history. Multiple remakes and ports have also sold hundreds of thousands of copies worldwide. Beyond that, the game is also receiving an HD-2D Remake, as announced in accordance with the franchise's 35th anniversary in late 2021. So, whether you're interested in what that remake is going to be all about, or just into a little gaming history, let's establish what's so great about Dragon Quest III. Though somewhat lost in translation, the plot of Dragon Quest III actually revolves around the fabled hero spoken of in the last two games. Drawing this trilogy to a close, players assume the role of Loto, who was known as Erdrick in North American releases, in a prequel that creates the legends on which the franchise's story is based. So, despite being the third entry, it's also not a bad starting point for new players. Upon beginning your adventure and talking to the occupants of the castle and town outside, you'll discover your first main objective, revolving around a thief and his very useful key. By speaking to the majority of the townspeople, you can easily discover plenty of information about what became of the thief and where to find his key. Aside from just saving your data, many of the game's royal NPCs will now give you the basics of the next major step in your quest. In a huge step forward for aiding the player and keeping track of this long adventure, each ruler will also remind you of their quest until it has been completed or upon rebooting the game. Beyond that, it's up to the player's own ability to explore and gather information in order to succeed on their quest. This game speaks its objectives so much more plainly than either of its predecessors. It's incredibly refreshing in a time of RPG gaming where clue-based dialogue was all the rage, and you had to piece together what to do and where to go next between vague and often poorly translated hints. In Dragon Quest III, you're often told where your next objective is, either by a king or some other notable person living in a point of interest, and you'll often be able to gather some additional information about the order of events too. That means that as you gather the random bits of information that the general population is more than happy to tell you about, you actually have a good sense of what matters now and what is just to be kept in the back of your brain for later. In a similar fashion to the first Final Fantasy, players can now select the classes of their companions, though your first character is still considered the hero of the story with unique attributes and a wide variety of skills. Alongside the hero, there are 7 possible other classes: the Soldier, Pilgrim, Wizard, Fighter, Merchant, Goof-Off, and Sage. The Sage is technically a promoted class though and can't be chosen from the start. All the other classes have their own pros and cons, and some have uniquely high traits, such as the Fighter's critical hit chance and the Goof-Off's extreme luck. Someone at the building where you recruit party members mentions you should take with you a Soldier, Pilgrim, and Wizard for a default game experience. In line with this thinking are 3 pre-made characters with each of these classes for you to add quickly if you're not picky on designing your own party. The pre-made characters also come equipped with basic weapons and armor pieces appropriate to their class. Continuing its history of revolutionizing the format of role-playing games, Dragon Quest III introduced the idea of a job system, which would go down in the history of JRPGs as a popular method of cross-blending classes and character abilities as a reward for players who had invested their time and energy to reach late-game bonuses. Upon finding a specific location in the game, the Shrine of Dama, players will be able to change their character's professions, which allows them to keep the spells they learned as one class, but can switch to another class to gain that ability for the next chapter of the player's journey. If the player chooses to change a character's profession, their stat values are cut in half, so some of your progress is maintained, but the character's level is set back to 1, and they now gain the stat bonuses and spells of the new class. This optional shift in the player's party can seem daunting to anyone who's just playing a straight RPG like any other, and can be avoided for simpler gameplay. On the other hand, this service offers a much more interesting and honestly easier way of completing the game for anyone who feels they truly understand how the game's systems work at this point, and are willing to spend a little more time and effort to reap the benefits. The hero cannot change classes, as no one can become a hero, and that class learns a few unique abilities inaccessible by any other magic-wielding class. Anyway, most of that stuff doesn't matter until well into the game, so let's talk about the world awaiting the player once they've got their class all set up. The geography of Dragon Quest III's world is very reminiscent of the real Earth's geography, with parallel towns to reality in their respective locations. For instance, Romali and Portoga are in the approximate locations of Rome and Portugal, respectively. The fact that this game's world is generally modeled after Earth itself means that players can generally assume where certain locations could be found, or where they personally are in relation to the rest of the map, rather than having to memorize a new fictional landmass for the sake of a video game or draw their own map. Dragon Quest III features an incredibly early use of a day-night cycle, which utilizes the passage of time to present different opportunities to the player. For instance, townsfolk will be more active during the day and shops will be open. At night, many stores will close and enemies in the wild will become more ferocious. Some villagers will even have dialogue very clearly hinting for the player to revisit the town during the night to find differences. This tells the player that some NPCs or opportunities will only be present during either day or night, so they'll have to diligently gather information from both times. The towns themselves are also so much more unique than most RPGs up until this point, even many of those released on PC. The player's experience at each town regarding the story, gameplay, and aesthetic presentation were more enjoyable and memorable because of the different events at each location. For instance, in the second castle town you visit, after completing a mission for the reigning king, he'll offer you the chance to rule his kingdom while he goes off to have a little fun among the common folk. It was a really unexpected and amusing event that allows the player to gather a little more information while assuming the role of a noble, but can easily be declined or undone in order to continue your adventure. My personal favorite town was Asaram, the desert city, which had a stark difference in personality between day and night. During the day, there are stalls where you can barter for merchandise, as well as a few standard shops, but at night, the theater comes to life, nocturnal vendors have different wares, and the atmosphere is a little more lively as well as a little more adult. This trope of a festive desert town is still a staple in many RPGs even to this day, with the modern releases of Octopath Traveler and Paper Mario: The Origami King. Most importantly, this isn't just another town that looked like all of the rest from the last two Dragon Quest games, with red bricks and green trees. Speaking of looking different, the village of Jipang, based on Japan in terms of both location and design, features unique sprites, roof tiles, and even its own song as a nod to the Japanese culture of the developers. The fact that this town is only accessible after the player acquires a ship also makes the player feel like they're really reaching new foreign lands. Even the monsters had a part in making this world feel more realistic and interesting. With the higher number of unique enemy types instead of just different palette swaps, Dragon Quest III began to feel like the player was actually visiting different kingdoms and countries within one larger world. Not only were the towns much more stylized, but the surrounding hazards felt like they belonged, like the Mummy Man enemy finding a new home in the desert-surrounded pyramid instead of just randomly wandering around the overworld. Every time the player crosses a bridge and sees a brand new enemy, instead of just a slightly different color of one they've fought several dozen times, it creates a greater sense of progress as they've discovered something new in a new land, even if they're just 4 steps out of familiar territory. Dragon Quest III may not look all that different from its predecessors, but it sure does feel different. It feels easier, more thought out, and more digestible. It finally feels like we have a game on our hands, the kind that you'd be willing to play beginning to end because it's fun, doesn't take an obnoxious amount of work, and keeps players invested in progression and growth. The creator of Dragon Quest, Yuji Horii, stated that he felt Chunsoft had finally reached the perfect intended structure of Dragon Quest, especially with the inclusion of a customizable party-based system, and he was right. With each entry of this series that I've played, I've become more interested in the next title. However, this third entry just solidified my interest in all future entries. Speaking from a technical aspect, the Dragon Quest franchise also introduced plenty of quality of life improvements in this third title that would move players several steps closer to the conveniences we find in games today. For instance, the user interface was improved, with more simple means of displaying the entire party's health, mana, condition, and equipment. You can also now choose where to go with the use of a Wing of the Wyvern, rather than just the last location you saved. And once you learn the spell Return, you can transport to any major town or castle instantaneously, just like you would use the HM Fly in Pokemon. This was a major step forward in completing the game without giving in to wasted time or frustration in walking back and forth between locations. These may seem like such simple improvements, but we have to remember the historical context here. While we received these games several years later in the West, just to put things in perspective, Dragon Quest III closed off the original trilogy just 2 months after the first Final Fantasy released to Japanese audiences. In North America, Dragon Quest would fall into a minor phase of obscurity after the NES era, as we missed out on the localization of these Super Nintendo titles due to poor sales in our region. Luckily, popularity of JRPGs with American audiences has been steadily growing over the last few years, with the Nintendo Switch receiving multiple remakes and ports of older Dragon Quest games as they were originally intended to be experienced. Considering the upcoming HD-2D Remake of this game, plenty of aspects could definitely be improved with more graphical capabilities, such as more detail on minor features like where buttons, pitfalls, and other clues or traps in the world may be. That would certainly reduce the amount of trial and error necessary in some of the dungeons and give this great game a fair shot at success in the West. It may wind up feeling simple by today's standards, but that's really because it had a big job in setting today's standards. More personified towns and cultures, dialogue, the JRPG job system. Dragon Quest III was a major step forward for role-playing games, leading the way in 1988 towards a format that JRPGs really haven't strayed all that much from in over 30 years. That is what's so great about Dragon Quest III. Thank you all for joining us on this episode of What's So Great About Gaming, as we went over the legacy of Dragon Quest III. Want to see some bonus content? Maybe support the creation of these videos? If so, check out the What's So Great Discord, Twitch, or Patreon. Links for all of those are in the description. If you want to hear what's great about another game, check out the link to our last episode, Sonic the Hedgehog 2, on screen or in the description. And please take the time to subscribe to be involved in the discussions here. Thanks again for watching. Now go play a great game. We'll see you next time.